The motel room door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. The outside hallway was quiet, lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that buzzed overhead. Inside the air felt still, too still. The TV droned on with a laugh track from a Friends episode no one was watching. One of the beds was messy, the sheets twisted and pulled halfway to the floor. The other bed looked untouched. The lamp beside it cast a dim yellow glow over a cluttered nightstand. There was a wallet, a purse, a sandwich left half-eaten on a paper plate. Everything suggested someone had planned to return. In the bathroom, 3 toothbrushes sat in a cup by the sink. A bar of soap, still wet, rested in its dish. Beneath the bed closest to the wall, a pair of tiny pink sneakers were neatly placed side by side, as if their owner had carefully taken them off before climbing in. But no one was there. No signs of violence. No broken glass. No blood. Just the eerie quiet of a room that seemed to be holding its breath. It was July 2004, just outside Redding, California, and the Myers family, Aaron, Leslie, and their 9-year-old daughter Sophie, were officially missing. They had checked in late that evening, reportedly on their way from Sacramento to Seattle. The motel clerk remembered them. Said the little girl was soft-spoken and the mother looked tired. The father paid in cash. They were only supposed to stay the night. But when housekeeping knocked the next morning, no one answered. By the afternoon, the door was still unlocked. Nothing was taken, except the family. Local authorities searched the nearby highways, airports, and wooded areas. Flyers went up across the state. Aaron Myers' truck was found in the parking lot with the keys still inside. No security cameras covered that wing of the building. No witnesses saw anyone leave. And there were no real suspects. Detectives were baffled. A family doesn't just disappear without a sound. Yet that's exactly what had happened. One day they were here. The next they were nowhere. No fingerprints from strangers. No ransom notes. No proof of foul play. The file was marked cold case within the year. Time passed. Tips dried up. The world moved on. Then, in January 2022, the Oregon State Police received a strange call from a hunter named Jake Duran. He'd been tracking elk through thick snow when he noticed something that didn't belong. A chimney hidden behind a curtain of pine trees. He followed the smoke until he came upon a small cabin, almost invisible from the ridge above. It wasn't on any map, and what he saw inside didn't make sense. Candles flickered through the frosted window. A woman sat at a wooden table, stirring something on a hot plate. A man with a long beard walked in holding firewood. And in the far corner, a woman in her 20s sat cross-legged on the floor, humming softly, and reading a children's book aloud to herself. Jake stepped back quietly and called for help. Within 72 hours, the FBI confirmed what they never expected. The Myers family had been found. Alive. And that was just the beginning. The Myers family wasn't known to anyone outside their modest circle. They didn't make headlines. They didn't stir attention. And perhaps that's what made their disappearance so unnerving. There was nothing about them that screamed mystery. No enemies, no dark past, no dangerous secrets, at least not on the surface. Aaron Myers worked as a diesel mechanic in Sacramento. A hard worker, the kind of man who kept to himself, clocked in early and rarely called in sick. He was dependable if distant. Coworkers described him as quiet but solid. He wasn't the type to draw suspicion or sympathy. His wife, Leslie, worked part-time at a local library. Soft-spoken and observant, she rarely socialized outside church or school meetings. Those who knew her recalled that she seemed distracted in the months before they vanished, tired, withdrawn, but most chalked it up to life, to stress, to whatever people carry behind their smiles. Their daughter, Sophie, was 9 years old at the time. A third grader who preferred books to people, fairy tales to playgrounds. Teachers noted how bright she was, but also how she seemed to drift, as if her mind was always somewhere else. She was polite, sensitive, and rarely caused trouble. They were, in every visible way, an average American family. In July 2004, they packed up their belongings into a dark blue pickup truck. The plan was to visit Leslie's cousin in Seattle and maybe spend a few days by the coast. It wasn't an official vacation, more like a change of scenery, a break, a breath of fresh air. Some believed the trip was a last-ditch effort to fix what was quietly breaking inside their home. Friends said the marriage had hit a rough patch. There had been whispers of counseling, late nights, money troubles, but nothing that felt unusual or dangerous. Just two people trying to keep things together while raising a child. The last confirmed sighting of the family was at a gas station near Red Bluff, California. Surveillance footage captured Aaron filling up the tank while Leslie bought snacks from the convenience store. Sophie could be seen through the windshield, reading in the back seat. It was 6:12 p.m. 6 hours later, they checked into the Evergreen Lodge, a roadside motel just outside Reading. The reservation was made under their real name. The room key was signed by Aaron. Nothing about the check-in seemed out of place. The clerk remembered them because Sophie asked if the motel had any books she could borrow. They were given room 14. The next morning the room sat untouched. The housekeeper knocked around 10 a.m. No response. By noon the Do Not Disturb sign was still on the handle. Staff assumed the family had stepped out for breakfast or was simply sleeping in. It wasn't until the third day, when the room was still occupied but no one had come or gone, that motel management got concerned and contacted the police. Inside the room the signs were subtle but strange. Nothing was obviously wrong, but nothing was right either. The beds were half used. The lights were off but the television was still running. The family's belongings were left behind, but so was a strange emptiness. It was as if they'd been vacuumed out of the space, removed gently without a trace. Their truck remained in the parking lot. No other vehicles were reported missing. The key was on the dresser. Investigators combed through the scene. There were no broken locks, no signs of entry or exit. No blood. No DNA that didn't belong to the family. Wallets, IDs and credit cards were all untouched. There had been no bank activity since the day of the check-in. Cell phones were left on the nightstand, both powered off. Their last phone calls had been ordinary. One to Leslie's cousin, confirming they were still on their way. Another to Aaron's workplace, letting them know he'd be gone a few days longer than expected. Neither sounded rushed or fearful. There were no ransom calls. No surveillance footage of anyone else entering their room. Dogs brought in for scent tracking picked up a trail that led briefly into the forest behind the motel, and then stopped. As if they'd simply vanished into thin air. Detectives began looking at every possibility. A voluntary disappearance. A premeditated escape. An abduction. They investigated the parents' backgrounds, searched financial records, even pulled Leslie's internet history to see if she'd researched how to run away. Nothing. There were no arrests. No suspects. And no bodies. Public interest in the case died quickly. It didn't have the usual flair of a media sensation. There was no drama, no clear villain, no scandal. Just a family that went to sleep in a motel and never woke up, at least not in any place the world could see. The Myers case was quietly archived, one of hundreds that year that went unsolved. But for those who knew the family, questions lingered like dust in the corners of a sealed room. Why would they leave behind everything they owned? If they were running, who or what were they running from? And if they weren't, who took them? Years passed. New stories took their place. New names made the news. And the Myers were slowly forgotten, their missing persons posters yellowing on bulletin boards and lost in outdated databases. Then came the winter of 2022. The Oregon mountains were blanketed in thick snow. Temperatures dropped to single digits. Few people ventured far off the main trails. But Jake Duran, a seasoned hunter and survivalist, was tracking movement through the pines when he noticed something strange. Smoke rising behind a jagged ridge. Curiosity pulled him toward it. He found no marked path. Just frostbitten trees, old footprints, and eventually, a structure that looked more like a forgotten storage shed than a home. It was built low, with slanted wood and moss-covered stone. No road led to it. No wires. No signs of connection to anything. But there was life inside. Jake peered through a narrow window and saw movement, a shadow. Then the faint flicker of candlelight. The outline of a woman sitting still. A man moving slowly, placing logs into a fireplace. A much younger woman sitting in the corner with her legs tucked under her, cradling a stuffed animal and reading aloud to no one. Her voice sounded like a child's. Jake backed away and quietly made the call to authorities. Within days, the FBI descended on the area with aerial support, ground teams, and forensic units. The property was secured. The people inside were questioned. And when the names were finally confirmed through outdated dental records and fingerprint matches, the world was reminded of a story it had almost completely forgotten. After 18 years, the Myers family had been found. But the bigger question remained, what had happened during those missing years? And why did they never return? The Evergreen Lodge sat just off Highway 273, its neon vacancy sign buzzing in the warm summer night. A typical roadside stopover, cheap, quiet, and mostly forgotten. It wasn't the kind of place where mysteries unfold. But that night, something happened behind one of its thin doors that would go unanswered for nearly 2 decades. Brian Kellner, the night clerk on duty, remembered every detail, because something about the family didn't sit right with him even then. They looked normal, he said during the first round of interviews. The dad was polite though kind of stiff. The girl came up to the desk and asked if we had any books. I told her we didn't, but she smiled anyway. That's what stuck with me. Aaron signed the logbook with a firm hand. Paid in cash. Asked if breakfast started early. Leslie stood off to the side, arms folded tightly, her eyes scanning the hallway more than the clerk. She didn't speak, not even when Brian offered to upgrade them to a larger room. At 11:45 p.m., room 15 called the front desk. The woman on the line said she'd been dozing off when a sound woke her, a heavy thump. She thought someone might have fallen, maybe furniture tipping over. But it was followed by nothing. No footsteps. No conversation. Just silence. She didn't call again. The next morning, room 14 still had the "Do Not Disturb" sign dangling from the handle. The curtains were drawn shut. The truck was parked in the same spot. From the outside, everything looked still. Housekeeping knocked twice. No response. At noon, Brian decided to use the master key. The room felt cold, not in temperature but in feeling. The beds had impressions on them, but neither was fully used. A suitcase sat open on the dresser, clothes folded but untouched. Sophie's sneakers were beneath the bed, lined up perfectly. The bathroom smelled faintly of soap. One towel was wet. The faucet dripped. There were no guests seen leaving during the night. No one checked out. No surveillance on that wing of the property. Whatever happened inside that room happened without witnesses or warning. Detectives arrived within hours. They photographed everything. The crime scene unit found nothing, no fingerprints besides the family's. No foreign hairs. No blood. No defensive marks on the furniture. No sign of struggle. Just a void where 3 people should have been. A statewide alert was issued. Flyers went up with pictures of the Myerses, Aaron with short brown hair and glasses, Leslie with a soft jawline and brown curls, and little Sophie, reading a paperback in the school yearbook photo they used. Speculation quickly filled the gaps where evidence didn't. Some believed they staged the disappearance. That Aaron had debts or enemies. That Leslie had finally cracked under the strain of a crumbling marriage and orchestrated a clean getaway. Others whispered about abduction, about someone slipping into the room unnoticed. But how could someone pull that off without a trace? No broken locks. No calls for help. No sounds beyond that single thud. Investigators followed every thread. Phone records, financial accounts, prior addresses. Nothing led anywhere. The Myerses weren't hiding anything obvious. No criminal records. No secret transactions. No pending lawsuits or custody battles. The family didn't even have a history of running. A few suggested cult involvement. Others claimed they'd seen the family hitchhiking weeks later near the Oregon border, but none of those tips could be verified. By 2005 the story had cooled. No journalists chased it. No true crime specials aired. It was simply another case that didn't lead to closure. Yet for those closest to them the hole remained. Leslie's sister called the detective monthly for the first year. Then less frequently. Eventually she stopped asking if there were updates, because there never were. At one point, Aaron's former co-worker told authorities that Aaron had seemed nervous in the final weeks before they left town. Said he once asked if it was possible for someone to just disappear and never be found. At the time it was chalked up to stress. Later it sounded more like foreshadowing. But still no one could figure out the why, or the how. The Myerses became ghosts. Names on a list. A file marked cold. The truck they drove was eventually impounded and sold at auction. Leslie's library card expired. Sophie's elementary school held a memorial in 2006, planting a tree with her name on a small plaque. The family storage unit in Sacramento was cleared out after the 3rd year of missed payments. Inside were boxes of children's books, old clothes, and a few family photos taped to the inside of a filing cabinet drawer. Everything was gone. No new clues. Just empty spaces. Then, January 2022. Oregon was gripped by winter. The air was brittle, sharp against the lungs. Deep in the forests near the Three Sisters Wilderness, Jake Duran, an experienced outdoorsman, spotted smoke against the snow-covered ridge. It was too far from any known trail, too isolated for a hiker or camper. He followed the plume, expecting maybe an injured traveler or an abandoned outpost. What he found was neither. The cabin was hidden behind a wall of rock and pine, camouflaged by years of weather and growth. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. Through a frost-covered window, he could just barely make out the flicker of firelight and figures moving inside. Jake backed away, returned to his vehicle, and made the call. Authorities arrived by snowmobile, then by helicopter. It took hours to locate the cabin again, even with coordinates. When they finally breached the structure, what they discovered turned silence into noise overnight. A man with a long graying beard. A woman with lines etched deep into her face. And a young woman who looked no older than 27, sitting in the corner beside a small pile of worn-out books and a weathered stuffed rabbit. She looked up and asked the agents, "Are we in trouble?" Dental records confirmed it. Leslie. Sophie. The family that had disappeared from a motel room in 2004 had been living off-grid under false names in a hand-built cabin for nearly 18 years. The world wanted answers. Why hadn't they come back? What were they hiding? Who, if anyone, helped them vanish? But the truth, as it would turn out, was even stranger than the theories. And it began long before the night they disappeared. Jake Duran wasn't new to the backcountry. He'd tracked elk across frozen ridgelines for over a decade, learning to read nature the way others read newspapers. He could smell a storm before it rolled in. Hear the weight of silence when something wasn't right. That morning had started like countless others, crunching through knee-deep snow, breath turning to fog, boots sinking with every step. But around midday something unusual caught his attention. Smoke. Thin. Pale. Drifting low through the trees. It didn't belong there. This area was far from any mapped trail, unreachable by road, buried under feet of untouched snow. Jake slowed, instinct sharpening. Fires in these parts weren't casual. They were warnings, or signs of something hidden. He moved quietly, weaving between snow-laden evergreens, boots muffled by powder. The smoke grew stronger. He began to hear faint sounds. Not animals. Not branches cracking. Voices. Then he saw it. A structure, if it could be called that, sat hunched against the mountainside. Built from mismatched lumber, stacked stone, and patched metal sheets. A crooked chimney spat out soft coils of smoke. There were no power lines, no visible plumbing. Snow on the roof had partially melted, revealing a hatch near the back. No tire marks. No human footprints. Just the stillness of secrecy. Jake crouched behind a boulder and raised his binoculars. That's when he saw her. Through a small frostbitten window, a figure moved across the room, then sat. Long hair, pale skin, knees pulled to chest. A soft voice began speaking. Then laughing. But something was wrong. It wasn't a child. Not physically. The frame was adult. But the voice, the tone, was girlish. Innocent. Like a performance frozen in time. Jake's gut tightened. He backed away slowly, careful not to snap a branch. Once far enough, he pulled out his satellite phone and called the sheriff's office. "I think I've found something," he said. "And someone needs to see it." By the next morning, law enforcement swarmed the area. Snowmobiles and black SUVs left trails across the white, cutting paths where none existed. The FBI was looped in immediately after the coordinates were confirmed. Too remote. Too suspicious. Too close to an unsolved disappearance that had haunted local records for years. Agents approached the cabin with body cams, radios, and silent hand gestures. They expected danger. What they found instead was confusion. The woman who opened the door looked aged but alert. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the wood frame. Behind her stood a man, tall, grizzled, eyes scanning everything. His posture suggested protection, not threat. And in the back corner sat a girl, or rather, someone dressed as one. A woman, likely in her late 20s, wore a faded pink sweater and checkered pajama pants. Her hair was pulled into uneven pigtails. She held a stuffed rabbit in one hand, a torn children's book in the other. She looked up with a wide smile. "Hi," she said brightly. "I'm Sophie." The air dropped. An agent leaned in, carefully asking, "And who are the others here with you?" The man stepped forward, his voice rough from years without use. "I'm Aaron Myers," he said. "This is my wife, Leslie. That's our daughter." There was a long silence. Cameras kept rolling. Radios buzzed with coded chatter. The agents didn't show it, but inside they were reeling. 18 years after the family had been listed as missing, presumed dead, here they were, alive, speaking, and offering their real names without hesitation. The group was immediately separated for interviews. A field psychologist was called in. Medical personnel began evaluations. Sophie, or the woman calling herself that, appeared healthy but developmentally paused. Her responses were disjointed, almost rehearsed. She called Leslie Mommy, and asked where her bedtime story had gone. The agents didn't push. Not yet. The cabin had no phones. No electricity. A small wood stove served as heat. The pantry was stocked with canned goods and dried meat. Journals were found, dozens filled with careful handwriting. Most entries described mundane daily routines: fed the birds, watched the trees, read to Sophie. But some pages were darker. We must stay hidden. Don't trust them. She's safest here. God told me they would take her away. Leslie's handwriting was fluid but obsessive. Certain phrases repeated again and again. She had convinced herself, over time, that the outside world was the real danger. That what happened in the motel wasn't a disappearance, it was a rescue. Aaron's journal entries were sparse. Fewer words. More diagrams. He had constructed elaborate escape maps, traps around the perimeter, and a rotation of watch shifts. His paranoia wasn't random, it was structured. Controlled. Routine. Sophie's writings were childlike. Crayon sketches of a house in the woods. Stick figures holding hands. Page after page of the same three characters. Mom, Dad, Sophie, drawn smiling under the sun. But as the FBI dug deeper, the first cracks formed. Medical scans showed Sophie hadn't seen a dentist in over a decade. She had untreated scoliosis and vitamin deficiencies. Her mental development had been arrested around age 9. She could recite bedtime stories word for word but struggled with simple math. She didn't know who the president was. She thought phones were only in movies. She believed the world had ended. Agents realized what had happened, not all at once but gradually, like fog lifting. This wasn't just a family off the grid. It was a prison. Built not with bars but beliefs. Back in Reading, retired Detective Ray Molina watched the news unfold from his kitchen table. He'd been the lead on the Myers case back in 2004. He never forgot Sophie's school photo, the little girl with a gap in her teeth and a book clutched tight to her chest. When he saw the footage of her now, still clutching a rabbit, still smiling like time had stopped, he felt something twist inside him. This was no survival story. It wasn't a runaway case. And it wasn't a miracle. It was something far more complicated. Back in Oregon, Leslie remained calm during interviews. She insisted they had chosen this life. She said God had warned her of a coming danger. That someone had been watching Sophie back in Sacramento. That the motel had been their last night in the fake world. Aaron didn't say much. Only nodded. When asked why they didn't leave, even once, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. She was safe here. She stayed 9 years old like she wanted. Agents asked, but she didn't grow up. He replied, why should she have to? And that question lingered in every interview room, every debriefing, every document the FBI filed afterward. Why would two parents choose isolation over everything else? What were they really running from? And what happens to a child raised in a world where growing up is forbidden? The tension didn't end when the cabin was emptied. It only shifted. Now the world waited, not for a search to begin but for the truth to unravel. The interviews began in silence. Aaron sat with his arms crossed, eyes unmoving. Leslie kept her hands folded, glancing at the floor, answering only when pressed. But it was Sophie who left the agent speechless. She giggled when offered hot cocoa. She asked if anyone wanted to play I Spy. When an agent asked her age, she smiled and said, 9 3/4. She was 27. The woman sitting in that chair wasn't pretending. She believed it. Her voice had the rhythm of a child's, her words drawn from bedtime stories, not adult conversation. Her memories blurred. She couldn't recall ever voting, driving, using a phone, or visiting a store. And when asked about the world beyond the woods, she said, it's gone. Mommy said it burned. The sessions grew longer. Psychologists were brought in. Specialists in trauma, developmental regression, cult recovery. One of them, Dr. Abigail Monroe, summarized Sophie's condition in 4 quiet words. She never had a chance. The team didn't rush the family. Pushing too hard could fracture Sophie further. But behind the scenes, they worked around the clock to piece the puzzle together. And then it started making sense. The Myers family hadn't simply vanished. They had erased themselves. Deliberately. Desperately. Out of fear, not accident. What came next would reshape everything the world thought it knew about their disappearance. Archived records, Arizona, 2003. Before Aaron, Leslie, and Sophie were listed as missing persons in California, they lived in Arizona, briefly. Not much documentation existed. No home purchase, no school enrollment, no digital trail. But with pressure and subpoenas, old police files surfaced. One report stood out. A tip made in October 2003 about a remote desert commune, operating under a man named Solomon Grant. Phrases like obedience camp, family separation, and reprogramming house were highlighted. Aaron's name appeared in that report. Once. A witness claimed he had joined in spring that year with his wife and daughter. The record said he left suddenly just 2 months later. That same report mentioned a possible retaliation list, names of people who'd broken the chain. That list disappeared. No follow-up. Until now. FBI Field Notes, February 8, 2022. Under careful questioning, Aaron finally cracked. It didn't come all at once. His hands trembled. His voice stayed flat. But eventually the weight of 18 years spilled out. He met Solomon through a colleague. A man of vision, Aaron had said at the time. After losing his job and struggling to fix his marriage, he'd been drawn in by promises of structure, peace, purpose. At first it felt right. Everyone smiled. They worked together. Ate together. No phones. No distractions. Just community. But within weeks that peace twisted into control. Children were assigned to other adults for growth. Husbands and wives were told to disconnect from fleshly bonds. Aaron resisted. He kept Sophie close. Leslie started questioning too. Then the threats began. Someone placed a blade under their door one night. A photo of Sophie with a red X drawn over it. A whispered warning, disobedient roots must be dug out. Aaron panicked. He tried to leave in secret, but they were followed. They stayed in motels, kept the lights off, moved every few days. By the time they reached Reading, they were out of money, terrified, and unsure of who was tailing them. So Aaron made a decision. We had to disappear, he said. Completely. Or they'd take her. He smashed a chair against the wall late that night at the motel. Made it sound like chaos. Then they crawled through the bathroom window, walked a mile through the woods to a road, and hitchhiked north. No credit cards. No IDs. No trace. He'd read about an old firewatch cabin in Oregon that no one had used since the 70s. It took weeks to find it. They arrived in early August. And they never left. Sophie was told the world outside had collapsed. That enemies waited behind every tree. That phones emitted tracking signals. That fire trucks were actually collection vehicles. She believed it all. Leslie homeschooled her using old picture books and notebooks filled with copied Bible verses. Aaron taught her how to trap rabbits and filter water. Birthdays were marked with acorns and songs. But time stood still. Each year they gave Sophie the same handmade card. To our sweet girl, forever 9. She stopped asking about age around year 5. Dr. Monroe later said, this wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. It was fear weaponized into parenting. But the outcome is still devastating. Would you have noticed something was off if you were Jake, the hunter? Drop a face with monocle in the comments if you're still watching. Additional findings, March 2022. After intense legal effort, the FBI received clearance to interview former members of Solomon Grant's group. Some were now scattered across state lines. Others had changed names, disappeared again. One woman, now going by Rachel D. confirmed Aaron's account. They were on a list, she said. Solomon said they were traitors. Said their daughter was marked for retrieval. He had a way of getting inside your head. He believed he owned people. That confirmed what the Myers family had been running from wasn't imaginary. But here's the twist no one expected. Solomon Grant died in 2006. Car crash. Confirmed by police. Public obituary. Body identified. He'd been dead for 16 years. When told this, Leslie collapsed into tears. Aaron went completely still. They had spent almost 2 decades hiding from a ghost. FBI debrief, internal memo. The trauma was real. The fear was lived. But the threat had long been gone. What began as a desperate attempt to protect their daughter had morphed into a slow-motion tragedy. They had built a lie so large it became their reality. And in doing so, they had frozen their daughter in childhood. When Sophie was finally told the truth, she didn't understand. But the world is gone, she whispered. No, Dr. Monroe said gently. It never left. You just weren't in it. The revelation fractured the nation. News outlets scrambled for coverage. Psychologists debated ethical recovery approaches. Commentators asked, were Aaron and Leslie victims? Criminals? Heroes? But beneath the headlines, one truth stood above all. Fear, unchecked, unhealed, unresolved, can build walls higher than any prison. And sometimes, even after the danger passes, the shadows remain. Especially when they're planted in a child's mind. The adjustment didn't happen overnight. The Myers family was placed in a modest, state-funded apartment near the edge of Portland. A caseworker visited daily. Therapists rotated in and out. Food was stocked. Clothes were donated. But peace, that couldn't be delivered in a box. Sophie sat in silence most mornings, her eyes fixed on the window, watching cars drift by like alien machines. When asked if she wanted to go outside, she would flinch. Street noise overwhelmed her. Billboards confused her. Music made her cry. Everything felt too loud, too fast, too unreal. The therapist said her mind had built its own world. The forest, the trees, the creaking of that old cabin, they were her constants. Safe, controlled. Now she was surrounded by things she couldn't name, concepts she couldn't process, people who spoke with urgency and smiled too quickly. One afternoon, her counselor gently asked, "What do you miss most?" Sophie paused, staring at her socks. Then whispered, "It was always quiet. No one expected anything." Another pause. "I didn't know I was missing anything, until now." Aaron stood trial in late April. Prosecutors painted him as reckless, dangerous, a man who took control of a child's life and trapped her in a lie. But defense argued from a place of panic. He didn't run for selfish reasons, they said. He ran from something terrible, something he couldn't fight. Leslie, dressed simply in gray, took the stand and spoke without trembling. He didn't mean to break her. He thought he was saving her. The judge weighed every word. Eventually, Aaron was sentenced, not to prison but to 6 months in a secure psychiatric facility for treatment. He didn't protest. Leslie chose not to return to a quiet life. She began volunteering at a shelter for women escaping controlling